A lot of black people ask questions like, where was God when slavery and colonization happened? Where was God when our ancestors were butchered to death and overworked in cotton plantations? And today, I want to explain something that will hopefully help you answer that question. By now, we all know that whoever created the universe made a decision to make black people the first human beings on the planet. Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 says, "And God said, let us make man in our own image and let them have dominion over all things on earth." Black people were created and given the power to rule over all creations, and indeed they did so for thousands of years. Black people were the first people on the planet to establish a civilization. They were the first people to develop family units, laws, currencies, politics, education, architecture, medicine, spirituality. Black people were the first people to understand how melanin works and how special it was. Melanin in ancient Africa was the basis of African spirituality, but when a mutation occurred as recorded in Genesis 6, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. When Africans started giving birth to non-melanated or slightly melanated people, inclusion became a problem, and therefore all non-melanated people were kicked out of the continent into the inferno called hell to establish survival in Europe. European civilization began in the cold caves in Rome, with the founders being Romulus and his twin brother Remus, who had to survive in the wilderness through suckling a she-wolf. Wolves took care of them until safety, hence the narrative dog is a man's best friend. When the twins grew up and learned about their identity, they decided to go back and retaliate. When a parent rejects a child and that child grows, survives, and perhaps becomes successful, when that child meets the parent again in future, the results can be unknown. And in the case of Africa and Europe, the results were toxic, graphic, and highly dangerous because the abandonment, the hatred, and the anger DNA was still alive. East Africa is not only the cradle of mankind, East Africa is also the place where albinism began. East Africans chased the mutants from the Garden of Eden into the cold hell. The mutants survived and developed equipments for their defense mechanism. When the defense equipments reached their peak, they decided to come back to Africa to butcher, enslave, and drag Africa through the mud because the heart was never healed. So where was God, you may ask? When you study astronomy, you realize that the black hole is the most powerful thing on this planet. But guess what holds it all together? A dark matter called melanin. Melanocytes that produce melanin are the second most sophisticated cells in the human body, after the pyramidal cells in the cerebral cortex that aid in thinking. Melanin is a powerful absorber of energy, yet words, feelings, emotions, sounds, and all living things all exist together in the spirit realm as energy. Melanin does not only block UV rays. Melanin can manipulate electrons. Melanin can absorb radiation. Melanin can create energy. Melanin can produce electricity. Melanin has power. And that is where God has been the whole time. The biggest lessons that Africans needed to learn here is the moment you exclude anything that is a part of you as not a part of you, then you're creating a future conflict for yourself. Whenever you reject a part of yourself, you're creating a resistance from within. And just like love can make the world go round, hate can make the world stop. White supremacy, patriarchy, racism, deforestation, animal cruelty, capitalism, poverty are all manifestations of a separation that occurred. They are all manifestations of a rejection, of anger, of a heart that was never healed. My people only perish due to lack of knowledge. For where there is no understanding, people perish. But as it is written in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. We are all one, and we are all each other's problem, and we must heal together in order to stop greed from benefiting from our separation.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your number one host and presenter, Agent Stories. There's something that I want us to discuss, something so much important. And for the longest time, we have been realizing what we've been learning is not the true history. Majority of us, especially a continental African, getting to learn about the power of black people and everything in regards that revolves around black people. I'm coming to learn what I've ever learned is called historical revisionism. It's not really what I'm supposed to be learning, but it is what those people want me to learn. They want me to know, right? And for the longest time, this has caused majority of us in thinking about us in a given way, because you find some people, a black person, right, associate themselves with something which is bad, like a black person, right? Because this comes from where they learn from. These people didn't teach them the greatness that comes with black people. These people just taught them how black people do bad things, how black people are not great people, right? And so this has brought a confusion, a huge confusion and a misunderstanding between black people. But in today's video, brothers and sisters, we are going to break down all these point by point. We are going to be discussing all this and why it is important for you as a black person to understand and to learn the true history, because this shows where truly you came from. And I think it's important, especially at this point, as a black person, you get to know your true self and your true history. Not being told by a white person, not being told by anybody, but being told by a black person who doesn't have anything to hide in regards to your history. And so, brothers and sisters, I'm welcoming you to watch this video, and then I'll be back. I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. So let's watch the video. I'll be back. I'm your number one host and presenter, Agent Stories. So let's get into it. I'll be back.
You would be surprised how much history is hidden in private museums. They don't allow these things in the big places. It's just like in Egypt, because the Arabs are not Egyptian. Don't make any mistake about that. It's just like we're in this room here. This is America. It would be hard to find a Native American in this room. The world has changed dramatically. There have been half a dozen invasions of Egypt, the Persians, the Greeks, the Syrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs. That is not Egypt. Egypt is no longer Egyptian. They have not a damn thing to do with the building of the pyramid. We now have hard truth, very hard truth, that Egypt was African when the pyramids were built. There is no question about it. This is not guesswork. This is not theory. We found the skeletons in the ancient graves. We found sculptures, which you'll never see when you go to Egypt. They don't put those things on display. But now we have the hard proof. And I'll deal with that later when we come to deal with the Egyptian section of this lecture. But I appeared before the Congressional Committee and I presented 12 witnesses, all European. Or they're going to say I'm Afrocentric if I show them this African said this. No. I'm going to take the very people that you think you will listen to. Columbus is the first person. I said, that's how I began. I'm not the first person to suggest there were Africans in America before Columbus. Christopher Columbus is the first person to say that. He actually says in the Journal of the Second Voyage that when he was in Haiti, Native Americans came to them and told them that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus may or may not have believed, but he actually collected samples of these spears that were sent back to Spain. They were meticulously, microscopically examined in Spain, and they were found to be identical, not just similar, identical with spears being forged in African Guinea, of 32 parts, 18 were of gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper. Not only were they identical metallurgically, the words the Africans were using for these spears were the words the Americans were using. African word for gold, Ghana. That's why it's called Ghana. Gold Empire, the Golden Empire. Presenting material which when checked out, when the metallurgists checked it out in Europe, they found the spears were identical in their ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys. How could you have linguistic and metallurgical identities like that? It is utterly impossible. Not only that, I then went beyond that. I not just showed Columbus. Ferdinand wrote a book about his father, and he said, my father told me that he saw Negroes north of Honduras. Columbus knew what a so-called Negro looks like. He was in Africa. That's how my book began. Columbus sitting at a table in Africa, arguing with the Portuguese. Ferdinand said, my father told me he saw Negroes north of Honduras. He not only heard of them in Haiti, he actually saw them north of Honduras. Vasco Nunez de Balboa, on September the 25th in the year 1513, I've got it down to the day. He's coming down the slopes of Paracu in Darien, which we now call Panama. And he and his men saw 2 tall black men among the Native Americans. They are startled. They haven't brought no black people there. Several of them commented it. Peter Martyr said they must have been shipwrecked. Then he also said they were Ethiopians. Well, Ethiopians, the word Ethiopian is not used for people of Ethiopia. The reason why Ethiopia gets that name, Ethiop means burnt skin. People of burnt skin would generally call them Ethiopians. So it's not referring to Ethiopia. Peter Martyr said they must have been shipwrecks. Lopez de Gomara said these blacks Balboa saw in the Indies were identical with the blacks we saw in Guinea. Rodrigo de Colmenares saw blacks.
Humanity went through 5 stages. The first stages are known as Australopithecine, black. Where were they living? Where you are living. How old? How long ago? 5.5 million years ago. Who was living in Europe at that time? No one. Who was living in Asia at that time? No one. Who was living in America North? None. America South? None. Bismarck Archipelago? No one. Australia? Tonga? None. Haiti? Fiji? Samoa? Who was living there? No one. Humanity was only here. 3.5 million years ago, Homo habilis. Where was he living? Here. Was he living elsewhere? No. 1.5 million years. Humanity at the stage of Homo erectus, the African that walks upright. Where is he living? Here. He lives here to populate the world. He passes through the Gulf of Eden, avoids Saudi Arabia, crosses into India. And then he goes through Kenya, Mijikenda, Tayar in Australia, and populates all the islands in between. Avoids Israel, avoids Jordan, avoids Syria. He also discovers fire. Then 150,000 years, modern man, known as Homo sapien. Homo sapien. The oldest Homo sapien, the bones discovered in Omo Valley in Ethiopia and Kenya. He started where? Here. Then he moves with his feet and his cows, mobile food, and his language, articulated symbolic language, and his brain, a bigger cranium, and he populates Europe. He is the first person to populate Europe about 40,000 years ago, known as Gromoldi. The first people to populate Europe were black people. They were known as Gromoldi. First people to populate England were black people. They were known as Bika. First people to populate India were black people. They were known as Dravidians. First people to populate Japan, black people. They were known as Masaba Negroes. Mulembe, Kamaku, Wagasile, they came from here. They populated Japan. That's why Japanese names are like Ugandan names. Takahara, Nakamura, Kato, Toyota, all those, because the first Japanese were black people. In ancient time, the whole world belonged to the black man, the black woman. You are the people that populated the world. You are the people that gave birth to everybody else. And quite significantly, and I am telling you this as a scholar, I have a library of 32,000 books. I have read each one of them, not only read them, but remember them. I have traveled in almost every corner of the world, lectured at the most prestigious universities. I am telling you that in ancient time, the only people who are on earth were you and your ancestors. You. And you are also the people of the scriptures. All scripture, be it the Rig Veda, the Namapali, the Peramperu, the Papyrus of Ani, the Papyrus of Hunefa, the Quran, the Bible, the Book of Zoroaster, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is all about black people. Black people. But I know you have not heard about this information. Why? Because when white people colonized the world, they also colonized the information about the world. Some of you who have maids at home, or if you get a maid when you finish this college, you are not going to teach that maid chemistry. You are not going to teach him about viruses and pathogens. You are not going to teach them about coach postulates. Because if they learn about this, they'll be saying, if you say go and cook, you say, oh, you know what, I cooked yesterday. And today, you might as well go and do your own cooking. Because I'm busy reading this wonderful book, about coach postulates, and he says, a virus must be available in sufficient quantities in a diseased person, for it to be blamed for causing a disease. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, white people hid the information about yourself. They didn't want to tell you you were a great person. Let me give you examples.
This is the first time I would say I am really, really proud of my ancestors, because they left nothing behind, nothing at all. I've traveled the world as a black man, and I have never seen a black country where the people who live in it are foreigners that were brought there by blacks as slaves. Not one single country. Yet the black race has more countries on earth than any other country. 54 are on the continent. 13 black countries in the Caribbean. So 68 black countries. There's not a single black country where slaves were bought from outside by black people. I've traveled the world. Not a single country in the world colonized by a black country. There's nowhere you go on Mother Earth where the language they are speaking was imposed on them by force by a black country. I've traveled the world, and I have never seen a religion that is imposed upon anybody anywhere in this world by a black country. The 68 black countries in the world, the largest continent by number of countries, not a single one of them has a nuclear weapon of mass destruction. Black countries across the world, none of them is responsible for what we call the military complex, where we are manufacturing dirty bombs and sending things into the water to pollute people. I've traveled the world, and I'm yet to see one product that was forced to be sold in another country by a black country. So it means the black race is the only race on earth that represents what the United Nations have been looking for the last 100 years. Peace. Yes? We fought internal wars just like anybody, and that is all we did. Therefore, in my travels, there was no place I went on earth where the people there pointed fingers at me and say, your people did this to me. Never. The black person is the only one who travels this earth, and no one who point a finger. That's what my ancestors left behind. Nothing.
Holy shit.
That has
When I was doing my master's to do the research on the impact of the Moors, my question was as follows. I'd heard a lot about the significance of Africans in developing the European academic system, but I didn't know where was the evidence. I want to see it distinctly. I want to see it in the Latin. I want to see it in the medieval. I want to see the documents. So I started having documents sent from the University of Madrid, a place called the Instituto de Arias in Spain, I had things sent from California, and reading through this information, I had roles, curriculum roles, in other words, what was taught at particular universities at particular points in time. I checked the listings of who were the teachers at particular colleges and universities. Why was a particular university established? What was its charter? What was its creed? When I started finding out that the major schools of Europe, the ones that are now considered the cornerstones of European intelligentsia and academia, Oxford, University of Paris, University of Naples, Bologna, University of Palencia in Spain, Salamanca. All these places had as their chartered purpose the study of the Moorish texts. They had set up these schools to make use of the information that was coming in. They were not all what's called cathedral schools. Cathedral school you went to only to study Christianity, Catholicism. These schools were developing to study the sciences and the philosophy that the Moors had been introducing in Andalus. And when you look and you see names like Adam de Marisco on the faculty roll for Oxford University in the 12th century, it might pass you by unless you know what de Marisco means. De Marisco means of the Moors. Adam of the Moors. Hence, many names, in fact, that people had in those days, you either said where you came from in terms of regionally, or who you came from in terms of blood. Hence the name Moor, that so many Europeans carry today and don't know what they're carrying. If they knew, if they look at one of in their books of heraldry, they'd probably pass out to see what's there. In fact, and I'll show some of the examples a little bit later. So these are things that were necessary, getting these texts and getting these curriculum roles to see for myself. And I have to say, my advisors, who were all Europeans, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, doctorate in history, all Europeans were shocked. They were like, well, how did you get this information? Why would you even think to look for such information? But they couldn't, as I say, they couldn't touch it. They still had to say, give me the grade, because the work was thorough. But to this day, I'll never forget the face of one of my professors when I came in with some of these documents in the medieval Spanish sent from Spain. He just sat there, kind of shaking, like he had Parkinson's. I see you've really done your work. So, I mean, this is something, obviously, that's required. We need to, as I tell, it's our responsibility as doctoral students, is we have to teach undergraduates. And I say we need an army of scholars. Definitely do the research, do the work, learn another language, and if you can, travel and engage. If you meet people from different places, everything will give you leads. I go through life as a detective. I listen to language, I look at linguistics and etymology, I listen to myth, putting it all together to try to understand what has come to pass, because these people have pulled so much wool over our eyes that it takes more than one disciplinary hand to pull it up. We need to take different disciplines as well to pull that wool off. So, I mean, this is something that, in fact, you'll find some historians will actually negate. I had one professor tell me when I was talking about the African presence in the Americas, in Mexico, and I was talking about the evidence in linguistics, and the evidence in religious practices, and the evidence in myth, and the evidence from documented accounts given by Spanish explorers. He told me, you're just grabbing up everything from everywhere. The myth is not acceptable. Well, that's not acceptable. Linguistics, you're out of your discipline. I said, if I came into a courtroom bringing one witness to establish a case, and just said, look, so-and-so didn't commit the crime, and here's my one witness to tell you why. And my opponent comes in, he's got 8 witnesses, wiretaps, artifacts, and everything else, and lays it out. Who's going to build a better case? Ironically, that's why the foundation of law is history, because it's teaching you how to pull it all together. But yet when it comes down to it, In the world of historiography or historicity, when you present this information to a European historian, they say, no, no, see, because you didn't give it as we put it. See, just read these authors. That's it. And don't start reasoning. I don't want to hear any analysis now. And when I did this in the presence of a historian from Mexico, this man who was a Mexican is telling me, you're right. Telling me, absolutely, absolutely. And this European-American Jewish fellow, European Jewish fellow, Ashkenazim, is sitting there saying, no, I've never heard that. Everybody can claim being in America. And this Mexican historian standing there telling him, yes, there is an African presence. You can go to Veracruz and see it. There's a tradition that you can find about Yanga in the tradition of Mexico. You see the Olmec heads. I mean, what more do you, I mean, this man is from Mexico. He grew up there, and this European American is telling him, you don't know what you're no, you're wrong. I mean, the arrogance is something else that's intriguing. The level of arrogance they would feel comfortable with doing this.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. Now, a significant factor in the confusion surrounding black identity today is what Carter G. Woodson famously described as the miseducation of the Negro. From colonial times through modern schooling system, black people were taught history through frameworks that were designed by and for societies that did not share their historical experiences, civilizations, civilizational trajectories, or collective memories. Instead of being grounded in African-centered histories, philosophies, and political developments, black students were inserted into Eurocentric narratives as peripheral actors. Enslaved people, laborers, or recipients of civilization, this educational structure did not merely omit black history, it actively distorted it, shaping how black people understand themselves, relation to power, progress, and humanity. The history that was being taught, it was being taught through foreign historical frameworks. They were not being taught in the lenses of an Afrocentric view. They were not being taught in the lenses of how it should be taught, like for black people. And you understand how this, as one of the most damaging aspects of this process, which teaching of black history as an extension of European history rather than an independent, continuous civilization story. Africa itself was often introduced at one of the point of contact with Europe, slavery. With the Europeans, when Europeans arrived, right? And this only implying that African history began when Europeans arrived. And that's not the entire truth. Remember, black people, Africans, they had their own history even before the Europeans came to the United States. And so if you understand that, you know what I'm saying, right? Now, this approach erased thousands of years of African state building, scientific knowledge, trade networks, governance, education, and philosophical traditions. As a result, black people were educated to see themselves as historically dependent on others rather than as producers of civilization in their own right. I talked about historical revisionism, and historical revisionism was used as a tool of domination. Understand this. This distortion aligns with what scholars identify as historical revisionism, not in the neutral sense of updating scholarship, but as a deliberate political project. Colonial and post-colonial powers revised history to justify conquest, enslavement, and exploitation. By minimizing African achievements and exaggerating European benevolence, these narratives constructed a moral justification for global racial hierarchies. Historical revisionism functioned as an ideological weapon. If black people were portrayed as ahistorical or a primitive, then their domination could be framed as natural, necessary, or even beneficial, right? These are psychological consequences of historical displacement. Teaching Black people their history through the experiences of those who oppressed them produced a deep psychological consequences. Identity formation relies on historical continuity, knowing where one comes from, what one people's built, and how they understood the world. When that continuity is broken, confusion and self-doubt emerge. Frantz Fanon argued that the colonial education alienates the colonized subject from themselves, producing a sense of inferiority and dependency. Many Black people internalized narratives of deficiency, not because they were true, but because alternative histories were systematically produced and systemically suppressed at the same time, right? The shock of rediscovery in the present moment. Yes, a lot of us are really shocked by rediscovering this truth, and this has been made possible by access of education, like real education, and what really Black people should be learning and need to be accessing, right? Now, today, as access to archive, African-centered scholarship, oral traditions, and independent historians expands, many Black people are encountering historical information that contradicts what they were taught. Now, this rediscovery feels shocking, but not because the history is new, but because it was intentionally withheld. Learning about ancient African civilization, global Black presence before colonialism, and resistance tradition challenges deeply ingrained assumptions. The surprise reflects not just ignorance, but success of a long-standing systems designed to control and, by extension, identity. Right? Resistance to reclaimed history. The rediscovery of Black history has not only been universally welcomed. Institutions that benefited from historical distortion often resists these narratives, labeling them as radical, divisive, and unacademic. You heard Trump one time talk about this, right? And this resistance reveals how deeply power is tied to historical storytelling. Control over history determines who is seen as legitimate, civilized, or challenge existing hierarchies, not just socially, but intellectually. As a result, historical truth becomes contested terrain rather than a neutral pursuit. And all in all, what you need to know is that the growing awareness among Black people of their true history represent more than just academic correction. It is a form of intellectual and psychological liberation. If we understand our past, this restores our dignity. This restores our continuity. This restores our purpose, right? Because it reframes Black struggle not as perpetual victimhood, but as a resistance against historical imposed system. The surprise may fail today is not evidence of failure, but proof of how effective historical revisionism was, right? And so as a Black people, we need to reclaim our history because it allows Black people to see themselves not as footnotes in someone else's story, but as authors of their own. I'm your host, number one host, and presenter Agent Stories. So let's watch the video, and I'll not watch the video, but thank you for taking your time and watching the video. I'm hoping to see you in my next video. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.